That time I got reincarnated as a demon lord, English, by LordedoMal44. 51 One-sided massacre final part. The black flames I released were cut in half. I was stunned for a moment, seeing the black flames that I had casually sent towards the boss of ogres being split in half, but soon after I calmed down, remembering the intrinsic skill natural to ogres, Rage of the Ogre, that allowed an ogre to go beyond his limits. The chief of ogres' aura had greatly increased, his physical strength and battle wills had also greatly increased, reaching a different scale. For a moment, seeing how he got stronger, I stopped blindly launching attacks. My opponent wasn't as weak as I had imagined after all. Seeing this, I couldn't help but smile, watching as the chief of ogres backed up a few meters, caught up with the general he had thrown behind himself, and carried her away from the area where the battle was taking place. He soon after came back and did the same to the geezer, who had been knocked out at some point because of my black lightning, and also took him away. I just stood there, waiting, obviously. The boss of ogres is the strongest ogre. Maybe he can give me a battle. Not really, but I can have more fun with him if he doesn't have any reason to hold back. Like I said, I still haven't found a reason to take this fight seriously. Not even Trainee, the most powerful creature in the forest, can beat me if I take a fight seriously in my current state. As he thought about that, still with a smile on his face, the boss of ogres returned, his aura concentrating around every part of his body to be ready to fight at every second. Even I had to admit, in his current state our physical capabilities weren't too different from each other, and he certainly had more experience with weapons and a battle will than I currently have. Despite that, I was taking it seriously now, and in this state he couldn't even make me smile seriously, let alone fight seriously. Well, are you ready to fight now? Or do you need some more preparation first? I can give you a potion of healing if you want. The boss of the ogres looked at me with a surprised look for a second, closing his eyes and getting a haggard look afterwards. Tell me, am I really that weak? Sad? No, that wasn't exactly what the chief of ogres seemed to be feeling. There was no sadness in his voice. He had accepted for some time that he and the ogres were going to lose this battle, since before I came here. What he was feeling was a little more complex than that, but there was some happiness in it. Am I really that small compared to the world around me? I looked at him, seeing how excited he was for the fight to come. The feeling of fighting an opponent of equal power, able to push you to his limits and yet you're still unsure of his victory. It made me smile a little more thinking about how he looked like some of the characters I like. There's a saying where I come from. A frog stuck at the bottom of a well will never know how big the ocean really is. You are strong. But when compared to the true strong around the world, you and I are nothing more than insects, which continue to exist on the basis of your goodwill. He looked surprised, probably comparing me to the most powerful thing he's known in his entire life, but I'm not arrogant enough to believe that I can defeat anyone who appears in front of me. Even now Seal warns me how Veldora is far more powerful than I am, with over 1,000 times my amount of spells. When I compare myself to that, I'm nothing but trash. And if I take into account that Veldora was sealed, then that bastard shouldn't even be the most powerful person in existence in this world. I'm a long, long way from being a threat to creatures like that. Still, I'm not that frog in the well. Even if it kills me 1 or 2 more times, I'm still going to discover everything this world has to offer me. But don't worry. Once the ogres are under my supervision, I guarantee you, we'll get to know this whole world. Nothing will hide from our eyes. A wild smile appeared on my face just imagining all the things that would occur for that to happen. The boss of the ogres had a wild smile as well, looking happy at the idea of exploring more of the world like me. A warrior race like the ogres, there's no way they wouldn't be thrilled with the idea of exploring the world and getting even stronger than they already are. If that's the case, then I'm glad it was you who defeated us. After saying that, the chief of ogres stepped forward, swinging his sword towards me. The priestess was exhausted. Keeping up a battle using spells one after the other was a task difficult for anyone. Firstly, magic is often used as a decisive weapon, designed to deal massive amounts of damage to opponents. Mages would rarely fight on the front lines, let alone using magic constantly like she was doing, and yet she had. Of course, using the arts she used, which combined an individual's inner magics and the environment's magics, was especially profitable, allowing a mage to fight longer. And yet she was utterly exhausted, on the verge of passing out, feeling her magics at their limit. And yet the opponent before her was calm, as if she hadn't used a single spell since the battle began. Even though she wasn't using arts and was instead just using the magics internal to her body, Tasuki didn't seem to mind the expense. It was almost as if she had no end to her spells, something Priestess was beginning to believe. So what? Do you have any other magic to use? Or could I finish this off? Hearing those words, Priestess couldn't help but grit her own teeth in anger. Her magic had proven useless against Tasuki, an enemy who would just ignore the magic she used or copy it, using his own spells against her. Now, she would ask if she still had any unused spells in her arsenal, as if she were a child seeing a trick a mother does for her daughter. Tasuki just didn't seem to understand how much work had gone into learning all those spells, which were now being ignored by an opponent who looked much younger than she was.
You really are blessed, aren't you? Seeing through my magic with ease. I confess I envy blessed people like you.
Tasuki looked at the priestess for a moment, getting serious when she saw how the woman looked a bit downcast. Tasuki herself couldn't help but feel dejected seeing the result of the battle on the woman. I'm sorry. I think I was possessed by Rimuru's spirit for a moment. Tasuki said this, slapping her cheeks with both hands and leaving 2 pink marks around the moon tattoos that were on them. A smile appeared on her face soon after, much more sympathetic than the mocking smile before. I agree with you. I'm blessed. But the thing I'm most blessed with is having Rimuru by my side. He's the kind of person who would make anyone strong. You should see Rigurdo. Really, old man, he's one of the strongest goblins in Tempest, regardless of his age. The priestess seemed surprised to see Suki's change in attitude, but Tasuki didn't seem to mind and approached the priestess without fear of being attacked. As soon as she arrived in front of the priestess, she held out a hand to her, as if greeting a friend. Sometimes I forget things and get a little too interested in fighting, usually when I meet someone good at magic. I apologize for that. I'm not as addicted to combat as Rimuru over there.
The priestess, somewhat uncertainly, accepted Suki's hand and got to her feet, not even realizing that she had dropped to her knees until Tasuki was in front of her. Rising to her feet, the priestess looked Tasuki in the eye and finally, gave up the battle.
After all, I don't have the slightest chance of winning, do I?
I really didn't. I'm Rimuru's right-hand man for a reason. Tasuki said this with a sincere smile on her face despite the content of her words. And then, turning towards Rimuru, she seemed to think about something for a moment before speaking again. Well, your children finished their battle and were taken for medical treatment. How about we go to them? We can enjoy some tea with some herbs we have.
Huh. Claro. Priestess was still confused by Suki's sudden change in attitude, but she seemed sincere, and besides, if she could be close to her children and see the state their babies were in, then she wouldn't mind following a person around. Totally weird. Besides, she had to admit that she was no longer fit to fight. As for Tasuki, she just turned towards Rimuru and sent a message to him using thought transmission. Hey, Rimuru. Huh, Tasuki. What's up? Are you busy? No, just being attacked by the boss of ogres, nothing to stop me from answering you. What do you need? I'm just calling to let you know that I finished my part and Seal finished hers too. The only one left is you. Oh, okay. Got it. I'll finish this here in a minute and meet you at camp with the others. Okay. See you in a bit. See you soon. Finishing his conversation, Tasuki turned towards the priestess and began to guide her to the camp where Tempest's goblin forces were tending to the wounded on both sides, goblins and ogres. The battle between Tempest and the village of ogres was about to end. Rimuru dodged yet another attack from the chief of ogres, without showing the slightest effort to do so. The chief of ogres recovered from his position and swung his sword again, trying to cut Rimuru again, but he dodged without difficulty again, not caring about the attack. Rimuru was fighting, with his eyes closed, hands clasped behind his back and not even trying to defend the boss's attacks, just dodging each one of them without looking. The boss of the ogres tried everything to attack him, attacking from every possible position, but the Rimuru didn't seem affected by it. Of course, despite that, the chief of ogres didn't care about that. Giving his all, using his ogre's rage to its limit, even though his body was on the verge of failing. It was only a matter of time before the fight was over, but because of his pride, he still wanted to make Rimuru hold his sword again, He wanted to make Rimuru take this fight seriously, even if that was just another way of saying that he was heading towards his own defeat. Rimuru, however, was determined not to allow himself to need his sword again, having resolved to take this fight seriously. And, after all, what kind of monster would he be if he gave his maximum against an enemy so much weaker? You think you can dodge forever? I'm starting to get used to your moves. If you keep this up, you'll get hit soon. Rimuru for a moment opened his eyes, looking the chief of ogres in the eyes just before closing them again, and then he smiled. There was a dark motive behind that smile and the chief of ogres could clearly see it. Rimuru was arrogant and liked to show off, a flaw of someone who is strong. Of course, the Rimuru was much stronger than the boss himself, so he was safe in his actions. So, let's get this over with? Tasuki-chan told me that we're both last, so I don't feel there's any reason to go on any longer. That being so, allow me to be serious, even for a moment, and show you why I can't take any of my fights seriously. Rimuru said that, walked away a few steps and kept his eyes closed. He wasn't in a position where he could use his sword, in fact he wasn't even in a fighting position of any kind. He was just standing there, as still as a person walking down the street, waiting for the moment to take the first step. There was no sign of a threat coming from him. Even so, the chief of ogres got serious too, prepared in case Rimuru was about to use something. He didn't know what Rimuru would use at a time like this or what his plan was to end this fight. He just knew he had an ace up his sleeve, whatever it was he planned to use. All he could do, in the exhausted, fainting state he was in, was face whatever Rimuru had in front of him, get through it, and teach Rimuru's arrogance a lesson. With that in mind, the chief of ogres positioned himself, ready to launch his final attack. If Rimuru intended to end all of this now, he wouldn't be the one to stand in the way. Come to me when you're ready. When Rimuru spoke these words, the chief of ogres stepped forward, not waiting for even a second. Using all the aura he had left, the boss of ogres rushed forward as lightning fast from where Rimuru was standing and gathered all his remaining aura into his sword. If he didn't land this attack, the fight would be over. After all, he wouldn't have the strength to keep fighting. Facing Rimuru, the chief of ogres swung his sword and his body fell face down to the floor, suddenly unable to move. No, it hadn't been sudden. Going back a few seconds in time, the chief of ogres realized that just before he lost control of his body, when he was in front of Rimuru, he opened his eyes for a moment. His eyes, unlike the usual gold, were orange, like sunset, and vertically slit like what he would expect from a snake. When that pair of eyes stared at him, the chief of ogres completely lost the control he had over his body. Unable to move his body, the chief of ogres could only glance at Rimuru's feet as he walked into their line of sight, crouching down so that they could look each other in the eyes. And then? Got it now? Rimuru asked with a happy smile on her face, like a child showing off to its parents. Of course, he didn't understand what had happened. He had never seen anything like this kind of skill before. Although he had seen similar skills before, he had never seen anything like this. This is one of my skills, Cursed Eyes. It allows me to use one of the curses I have against my opponents. In fact, the one I used on you was paralysis. Hearing this, the chief of ogres couldn't help but think of a basilisk. This monster that can use cursed eyes can petrify anyone with just one look, and even ogres were careful when fighting one. It makes perfect sense that if Rimuru had the skills of one, then he would need to hold back in a fight, trying not to instantly defeat enemies. Besides that, I still have poison, blind, petrification, and fear. They're all very useful, but using them the fight disappears and loses all the fun. Of course, this is just one of my skills, and I have even stronger skills than that. The chief of ogres smiled at this, slowly feeling his smile turn into a laugh as he finally realized who he was fighting. After all, did he even have a chance to win? If Rimuru didn't want fun and instead just defeat them, or wanted an extermination of all ogres, then he could do that. Against someone with such speed and strength, able to use multiple powerful skills, what could ogres do? Rimuru could easily defeat them all by fighting at close range and using his skill to paralyze or petrify them all, preventing them from fleeing in the same way. It's just impossible to defeat an opponent who can defeat you just by looking at you, after all. Now that the battle is over, how about we retreat? I think you and the other two still need medical attention, don't you? Your wife and children are there. Besides, We have another very important matter to discuss. The boss used all his strength to move his head a little, trying to look Rimuru in the eye. He had lost, he had recognized him as his new boss and, until he was able to defeat him, he would help Rimuru. Still, he was surprised by what he heard. Victory party.